Hazur, Assalamu alaikum. As Ahmadiyya is expanding in the world and we are having new converts in large numbers, some of them some of them amongst those born to Ahmadi parents are taking responsibilities in the community. Hazur, keeping in mind the above, although the people holding offices in the community know the answers, I have a suggestion to make regarding an important matter, which I think is now suitable in the form either a scholarly person delivers a lecture or to be discussed in Majlis-e-Irfan or any important meeting of the Jamaat in the presence of Hazur, which is as follows. What is the difference in the meaning between Silsila Ahmadiyya movement and Nizam-e Silsila Ahmadiyya organization? Secondly, the connection of branches with the center of Silsila Ahmadiyya movement. Thirdly, on what matters branches controlled by the center need guidance from the center, and what sort of matters can be decided at the local levels at the branches without referring the center for advice.
You have spoken on a very important subject. The need for this was felt by me right from the beginning, and during my first address to Majlis-e-Tehreek-e-Jadid, I pointed out that the foreign expanding Ahmadiyya communities, foreign to Pakistan I mean, do need such enlightenment on the administrative matters. Otherwise there might be some, and there have been in the past, many misunderstandings resulting into in some places almost rebellion, in some places some people having lost their faith or injured their faith or becoming uniform to Ahmadiyya, and also some experienced murabbis and Waqf-e-Zindagi suffered a lot because of this, and some had to be expelled from the Waqf and some had to be expelled from the Jamaat because of their maltreatment of the situation. So this is a very important subject you have drawn my attention to, and it so happened that either this very morning or yesterday I spoke to Chaudhry Hamidullah Sahib Wakil-e-Ala on this subject. I said, I am surprised that so far Tehreek-e-Jadid has not produced that literature on this matter which I wanted them to do. So Chaudhry Sahib told me that this task was entrusted to some people, so he would make inquiry. Have you written to them? Not yet? Tomorrow somebody is leaving, tomorrow morning. Well, what time? Sorry. What time is he leaving? If it could be sent to that person. In the morning prayer you can collect. That's all right. So no hurry. But they should do it immediately. They have taken very long. Thank you, Jazakumullah.
It could be almost the whole day during my tea time, during my lunch, and after my office.
Composing this.
To compile this whole thing.
Good. He puts in a lot of labor into his questions and makes quite some research work and mental work. Sometimes he keeps awake the whole night to search for a question, in search for a question. And also he brings color to our Majlis, doesn't he? Haven't you noted it during your short stay? But the other colorful person is not here, unfortunately. That is Mr. Muhammad Abdul Rashid. Now, Wasim, tell me, you took such an important decision without even letting me know, and just went ahead with it in a moment of temper. You don't know about yourself? The decision, which was an important decision in your life, you took without consulting me, without intimating me. After it had been taken, I was told by your mother-in-law, she wrote to me from America. And you living so close, you couldn't tell me about it. Keep it in view in future always. If possible, refer to me all the important decisions, because one prays and one is sometimes guided by Allah, and then it prevents people taking decisions in haste.
My parents.
Huh?
My parents. They are very scolded to this point. But knowing that Hafsa was here,
So I didn't know that they have, but I am doing that now. Please sit down. Yes, please.
So it's not a question, but as Azur said that this Majlis Irfan takes time to prepare and all these things. Now, last night there was a question that 3 times Asa has appeared in Quran, while I went and took a long time to find out how many times this word Sa'a was in the Quran. I prepared a list and it's not all complete, 35 times.
Just a moment. Yes, I knew that. This is why I questioned him.
Yes. So
I what was his authority, because it was obviously wrong.
Well, I counted only 35, maybe more.
Tell me, why did you take so long to find out? It was so easy to find out. Had you consulted a key, all the verses containing Sa would be written in order, and in just one short list. It was that easy. You shouldn't have gone to that much trouble, but anyway, that gave you an occasion to read the Holy Quran. The time was not lost. But if you are in a hurry to find out something of this nature, always go to some key that is called Khalid. In English they call it reference for what? Concordance, that's right, yes. Concordances are published, some very good ones. One which I am using nowadays was published in Egypt. What was the name of that? Al-Mawjud. It's a good one. So that is the beauty of Mr. Muhammad Abdul Rashid. He's so emphatic and positive about the statements that one is taken off guard. And later on they appear to be completely false. All of them. But the confidence, with which he speaks, that is beautiful. So any questions, please? Today, Mr. Bashir Hayat has failed us, inasmuch as he has only asked one question which was already answered. Fine? You have got some? Oh, good, come on. Okay, so please let's see.
Would Hazur kindly let us know who were the founders of Deoband and Barelvi Muslim institutions in India and when they were founded? Please also inform us of the main differences in their beliefs.
That question, I remember, is already answered in detail by me a few weeks ago. Perhaps you were present, weren't you? No? Huh?
I think I was not.
Right. The founder of Deoband was Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi. And Deoband was founded, in fact, in collaboration with the then British government, who supported Deoband or constitution, founding of Deoband financially, and gave them some sizable financial help for quite some time. I think till the partition days or about that. So the suggestion also had its roots with some British government educationalists and things, and the idea was started, and then ultimately it was put into practice, and it was also being inspected by the British government from time to time. So in fact the history of Deoband tells that the allegations that they hurl against the Ahmadiyya community is exactly the allegation which should be raised against them. And in that case it is true. But still we don't use this, we don't employ it because we consider it just a small mean thing. How can this reflect upon the good intentions of those scholars who went for a Muslim institution? So I'm just telling you by way of information, not that we have any objection to this. We are much more broad-minded than these enemies of Ahmadiyyat are. They raise objections against us which are completely without foundation. While when we find them in exactly the same situation, we don't mind, and we don't allege things to their intentions because we don't know the intentions. The same is exactly true of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian government, the present government and their forefathers, they were founded, this regime was founded with the active help and participation of the British government. So much so that a treaty was signed between the grandfather of the present king, and again, in the first place, his grandfather, grandfather, was also brought into power with the help of British government and with the help of Abdul Wahab, Maulana Abdul Wahab, who had just founded his sect which is called Wahhabis, who was an Ahle Hadith, a very pious, well-learned gentleman, who in fact raised his voice against idolatry which was penetrating Mecca. And he did a great service to Islam by fighting out and rooting out the elements of idolatry which was entering Mecca at that time, and people had started prostrating before the grave of Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to begin with, it was all right, nothing wrong with that. But they were supported by these Arabian nomadic chiefs who are now the family who rule Mecca. And they came into some sort of agreement, and with their mutual help, they wanted to rise to power. The British government at that time was very much against the Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, and they wanted, in the name of liberty for the Arabs, to dislodge them. While Saudi Arabia at that time was being governed by Sharif Mecca, he was called Sharif, but it was at that time his government, he was governor or something like that, who was seated in Damascus. So Saudi Arabia was controlled from Damascus, while the real government lay with the Turks, and that governor was appointed by the Turks. So a sort of rebellion was hatched in Saudi Arabia, and they captured Mecca and the areas around them. Now, I'm talking of the grandfather of the present king. And his name was, as far as I remember, his name was also Abdul Aziz. So there are two Abdul Azizes, one the first founder and one the second founder. I'll come to that later. So they also have links of some sort with Deobandi sect, so this is why I'm shifting to them now. I'll come to connect the things later on. So first Abdul Aziz I'm talking of, Abdul Aziz the first. He was brought to power with the help of the British government. But when Turkey ordered the governor of Syria to move against them, he moved with some force and dislodged them from Mecca after a while. And then they were driven to the desert and again started waiting for their time. In the meantime, this Wahhabi movement became more and more popular, and it was sent further south to the Sheikhdom, and or north, is it? Sheikhdom is further southeast? Southeast, yes, that's right. Yes. So for 2 generations after that, they remained outside Mecca. And their kingdom, who was founded, was also lost within a matter of some years. But then, at the time of King Abdul Aziz, the famous, again, an agreement was reached between him and the British government. And that treaty is still here in England at the British Museum Library for everybody to be seen. And it has been also published, the gist of that, and the important items have been published in various books. Philby also has quoted that in his book, The Arabs or something is the name. But he has discussed that agreement in detail and given all the items in fact. According to that agreement, the Saudis will be brought to power with the help of the British government, and they would be paid 5,000 sterling annually, and they would also be paid about 700 some carbines, given 700 carbines with ammunition. And as a result of this help, they were also bound, and still the agreement, I think, is still good, because it was never repealed to my knowledge. But that is neither here nor there, but let's forget this. Anyway, according to that agreement, Saudi Arabian foreign policy was to remain under strict British control. They could not make any agreement with any foreign government without prior consent of the British government. They were free within, subject to certain conditions. One of the conditions was that they would not be permitted to stop any other Muslim sect from performing Hajj at Mecca. That's a very interesting clause, and let's study. I think it should be studied whether we can invoke it today in our favor or not. But it's a very strange clause that the British government sees to it that the sanctity of Hajj is not violated, and the present regime, even at that time, tended to violate it and stop some other sects from coming to Hajj. particularly those who belong to Sharif-e-Mecca group, they were in fact forbidden for quite a few years by them from performing Hajj. So they belong to the Ahl Hadith sect, as you know, and those Deobandis are also Ahl Hadith. So they have one common feature between them. Both are Ahl Hadith, and both have British history at their back, British collaboration, history of the British collaboration at their back. And both are forward in alleging that Ahmadiyya Jamaat was founded by the British government. So perhaps that is guilty conscience. Otherwise, guilty without guilty conscience, one cannot do such, make such wild allegations without any rhyme or reason. So anyway, these are the Ahl Hadith people. But there is a difference between the Ahl Hadith of Saudi brand and Ahl Hadith of Deobandi brand. Among Sunnis, the divisions are of various types. One large division is between Muqalladeen and non-Muqalladeen. Muqalladeen are those who believe that after Ahmad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, some great imams appeared in various forms. And they were the people who understood Islam to the extent that whatever they said is to be followed. And nothing can be said against them, even if that is based on sound logic and the Holy Quran and tradition. So once the Imam is quoted, their argument is finished. So majority among the Muslims are Muqallidin, both in jurisprudence and in their ideologies. So Deobandis are Muqallidin, Ahl Hadith plus Muqallidin. This is why they follow their great leaders, scholars like Maulana Ashraf Thanvi, and he's also considered a sort of Mujaddid by them, and Maulana Muhammad Nanotwi and Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, and quite a few other leaders in the past as well, are strictly followed by the Deobandis. But Wahhabi branch, which is Ahl Hadith, pure Ahl Hadith, they don't believe in taqleed at all. Each one is free to make his own inference. So that is the difference. Now, difference between Ahl Hadith and others, like Brelvis and some others, that lies in the importance of Hadith mainly, vis-a-vis the importance of other foundations, let's call it, there are 4 foundations on which Sharia, the law of Islam, is based. And they are the 4 sources. One of the sources is the Holy Quran, and the other is Sunnah, that is the act of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his word. And the third is Qiyas or Ijma, and then there is Qiyas. So these people, Ahl Hadith, lay so much stress on the second source, that is Hadith and the act of Huzur Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that they believe that whatever has reached them by way of Hadith should be followed, even if there is an apparent clash between that and the Holy Quran. So they convince themselves, justify their following Hadith at the cost of the Holy Quran by saying that in fact we don't understand the Holy Quran as well as Ahmad sallallahu alaihi wasallam does. So his word is obviously the true explanation of the Holy Quran. So even if there is an apparent contradiction, we would follow the word of Ahmad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, knowing it to be the true interpretation of the Holy Quran. Now there are others who don't belong to Ahl Hadith. They argue that we are not sure whether that thing was really said by Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam or not. You are taking it too mechanically. Even if the sources which related that particular tradition are sound, links between us and Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam apparently is sound, but so many years have passed, we don't know really. So the best criterion would be to consider the Holy Quran as the touchstone and put the traditions to this touchstone. If according to the Holy Quran a tradition is not contradictory, it should be accepted. If according to the Holy Quran it is found to be contradictory in some ways, so it should be rejected, not because it was a tradition of Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but because it is impossible for our Huzur to have said anything contrary to the Holy Quran. So the inference drawn is simply this, that this tradition is wrongly attributed to our Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he must never have said it. And when we know that hundreds of thousands of traditions have been invented by people of the later ages and which have been rejected by great Muslim scholars like Hazrat Imam Bukhari, and he himself tells us that heaps upon heaps of traditions were rejected by him because there was no reliability for them. So put them to that heap. That is the opposing view. Count them as something which you never said, So this is the major difference between them on the one hand and many other sects on the other. So these are Ahle Hadith and Deobandis as against the rest of the Muslim sects. Now among the various Muslim sects, there is one sect which is called Barelvi. That sect is mainly found in India, and it has received some bad or even, let's call it, worse influence from the Hindu culture. And because of that influence, they have become almost idolaters. We will have to treat them as Muslims because they believe in Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But according to their belief and their practice, if they had not believed in our Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it would have been very difficult to differentiate between them and other idolaters. Because according to their belief, those dead saints of Islam, which have long been buried and have appeared before their Lord Allah, they are still alive like other people. And it is permissible to pray to them like you pray to God, and to ask them to help you. And they listen to you when you go to their graves, and they are as if they are always present in the vicinity of their graves. And they sometimes, according to them, visit some places, even if they are not buried there. So mazar actually means this. Mazar means a place which is visited. It does not mean a grave. So when these people build mazars and go to mazars and submit their prayers there, this is the significance of mazar. Mazar in Arabic means a place of ziyarah, where you go and visit. So the ziyarah, commonly people think that it is called mazar because people go to that place. Well, the true significance does not lie in this direction. The true significance of mazar is that these places are visited by the souls of the old dead saints. This is why they become mazars. So they believe like the mazar of Data Darbar of Data Ganj Bakhsh, that is a mazar. And according to my investigation, there are a few well-known mazars where the old saint is not buried. It is just a mazar because of this significance. They think even if he is not buried here, he comes and visits here. And a grave is made over that place. So these people pray to them, even they to prostrate to their graves. If you go to Data Darbar, you will find so many people prostrating before. And they go further and extend this power of beneficence to these dead saints to the extent that they distribute certain qualities among the various saints, and then they are known as bearer of those qualities, possessors of those qualities. For instance, in Hazara district, you will be surprised to find that at every graveyard, on some graves there are various pieces of cloth hanging over a grave. And some are red and some are white and some are black and some are blue and some are multicolored and things. There's so many such flag-like small flaglets hanging over the graves that one is surprised to find why it is happening. So once I found out, and I was told that this particular sign indicates that this saint who was buried here, he could deliver sons to women. So that saint can cure cold, and that saint with a red flag on, he can cure tuberculosis. And that saint, for instance, with a black flag on, he can cure leprosy, and so on and so forth. So each quality of each quality of healing is distributed among the various saints. And it is very common in Hazara district to come upon these saints who have particular healing power. So this sect, in fact, has gone so far in idolatry that ultimately, when you reach the concept of Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the things go completely out of the last limit of your imagination. Those who treat these ordinary saints, ordinary people about whom you don't know anything, like this, what would be their view about Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam? That is the main thing, where ultimately the difference is so strong that they go on fighting with each other and shed each other's blood on this fundamental point for them. Their concept of Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that of an omniscient who knows everything, like Allah Ta'ala does. A being who is omnipresent, who is present everywhere like Allah Ta'ala is present, and who knows the future as completely as Allah Ta'ala does. So the result is that virtually there is no difference left between Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the concept of God. And they say that he had no body. And when the Ahle Hadith say that Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born, they mean a different thing. And when these Brelvis say that Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born, they mean quite a different thing. During the Maulud Sharif, the birthday of Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they sing songs from every mosque, and the whole night they go on speaking on this pet subject, and they tell everybody that when the birth took place and everything was ready, no child was born. Instead, an angel brought a light from the heaven. And that light was given the shape of a child. And that child was called Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the birth of our Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam according to these Barelvis. So they say he was a nur, that is light, and not a bashar, that is ordinary person. So major difference between them and the Wahhabis precipitates to this particular point, whether he was a bashar or a nur. And the Wahhabis quote in the verse of the Holy Quran, which is most often in their favor, Kul innama ana basharum mithlukum yuha ilayya annama ilahukum ilahu wahid. O Muhammad, peace be upon you, tell everybody that you are a man like themselves. Innama ana basharum mithlukum. I am a man like yourself. Yuha ilayya annama ilahukum ilahu wahid. With the only difference, and that is the most important difference, that I am spoken to by God. It is revealed to me that there is no God but He, that is Allah alone. So whenever you are walking in the streets of Pakistan and you hear this verse spoken from a mosque, you should immediately know that this is a Wahhabi mosque or Deobandi mosque. And then you will hear a barrage of filthiest invectives from a nearby mosque against that mullah who recites this verse. And that mullah would be so deeply hurt with listening to this verse that he would think that he has slapped him on the face intentionally by reciting this verse. So he would say this and that to you and to your mother and your forefathers and all that. Who are you to call our Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam a bashar? You don't understand the meaning of this verse. And then he would start reciting the verse of Surah Nur, in which Allah Ta'ala tells us that, Hafiz Sahib? Allah Nur Samawati wal Ard, Masal Nurihi Kamishkatin, Fiha Misbahun, Al Misbahu Fi Zijaja, Waka Banduriyun La Shirqiyat La Wala Gharbiya, Yakadu Zaytuha Yuziyo Wal Alam Tamsa Sonar. Nurun Alam. Now this verse, they go on reciting. And they say, you have forgotten this verse and you have started that verse. That verse means something completely different. This is beyond your limited and confused understanding. So the fight began. And there has been debate going on for centuries over this Aswin fact among the Muslims. Those people who say Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Noor, they also attribute, as I have told you, qualities, other qualities of God to him, like a complete knowledge of the future and a presence everywhere. So I have read in the Wahhabi books who object to this, and they have illustrated their objections in a way that the whole exercise is just a shameless exercise vis-a-vis the concept of Ahlu sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some Wahhabis have written that, oh Barelvis, do you think that when you are performing your act of husband and wife, Huzur Akram sallallahu alaihi wasallam is also present there, watching you? Shame upon you. So they retort. They said, shame upon you. Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam does watch, but then out of coyness, he casts his eyes downwards and doesn't observe. But he is there. You know, that sort of absurdities go on. And they are all Muslims and we are not Muslims. Imagine. And then they say, so much has been written, I mean it's just filthy to recount every part of that debate. But they say Ahmad sallallahu alaihi wasallam knows everything about future in every detail. These are the Barelvis. So, according to Barelvi's fatwa, all those who do not believe in these things are pakka kafirs, non-Muslims. And some have said that their kufr is much worse than the Ahmadis' kufr. Yet they forget conveniently all these things and declare us all together as not Muslims. Such things are happening in Islam, unfortunately. So there are the major differences between the Barelvis and the founder of the Barelvis. In fact, these views are much older than the founding of Barelvi sect. Many Muslim scholars earlier as well thought that Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had these qualities, abnormal, superhuman qualities. But a regular sect in the name of a Barelvi sect was founded by Maulana Sayyid Ahmad Raza Barelvi, Imam Ahl Sunnah. He was born in Bareilly, and he is known to be the most highly respectable Aimma of the Bareilly sect. And his books censuring all the rest of the Muslim sects are most pronounced in this respect. He is extremely intolerant of any other view than the Bareilly view. And the language he uses is so severe and so strongly censuring others that sometimes it's difficult to read that language. Oh, they have plenty of them, absolutely. The Urdu language abounds in such books. There is no authority behind their views, so they can't be authoritative books. What do you mean by authoritative books? Oh yes, they believe in everything. Even if you write a book about the great saints and concoct stories and write anything you please, that will be taken as an authority on the subject. It will be an authentic book. So anybody can make stories, and those stories will go on the annals of their history. And those stories will be treated as good, as right. Anything you can do. You can say a saint was there who went and fought with God to get back certain souls, and he brought them back, and attribute to any known saints of theirs, they would immediately believe this, right? Absolutely. This must have happened. Very clearly. They have their books, so many books. The Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi has written book. Tahzir-un Nas, for instance, is one of the most authentic books written by their scholars, and that is by Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi himself. And nowadays in Pakistan, a great demand is being made, very strong demand is being made by the Barelvis for confiscation and proscription of this book, Tahzir-un Nas, because Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, before the coming of Hazrat Masih Maud Wasalam, had written on the subject of Khatam al-Nabiyyin in this small booklet. It's called Tahzir-un Nas. And he forwarded the same views on the subject of Khatm Nabuwwat as are believed by Ahmadis. He is the last of the scholars before Masih Maud Wasalam who propounded the same views on the subject. Before him there were so many others, but I am talking of this particular one. So in the present, during the present struggle between Barelvis and Wahhabis, which is waging in Pakistan, the last demand that I heard of was this, that this book must be confiscated immediately by the government. If the government doesn't do it, then we'll see to it that their mosques are demolished and they are killed and slaughtered and things. So those demands which were being made against Ahmadis previously, they are being made against each other now on these subjects. all this is just facade. And we don't approve of it. We are not happy with this because this is most terrible. This is in the name of Allah to create hatred and disorder and cause misery to innocent people. This is not Islam. It will bring bad name to Islam, whether they do it to Brahmins or to Wahhabis or to us. Yes, please. Yes. I'm looking at you.
Assalamu alaikum. I just want to ask Hazur that how many minimum verses are to be recited while you are saying your prayer after Surah Fatih?
Thank you. All these Muslim scholars are agreed on this, that if you say 3 verses, that should suffice. Because it is a plural. 3 is a plural. And just by reciting 3 verses, you fulfill the demand of the recitation of the Holy Quran. But there is one exception. If a verse is long enough to be more in size than a small surah containing 3 verses, then that should be a substitute for 3 verses. And in that they particularly quote Kal Ayatul Kursi, Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum, and they say this is one of those verses which is long enough to be larger than many small surahs. So 3 verses, that is to say maybe a surah containing only 3 verses, because there is no surah with less than 3 verses. And this is one of the supporting argument in favor of those who believe that the minimum should be 3 verses. They say that you can't say less than a surah. Now, I mean, if you say a surah, nobody can object that you have not read the Holy Quran. And when you find a surah with 3 verses, that is the minimum. So this is their foundation for believing that 3 verses should suffice. And then the other part of the argument is that if a verse is longer than a surah, and that surah is sufficient, why should that verse not be sufficient? So this is the criterion put forward by various scholars. And Ahmadis also agree with that.